Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Nick Driver, and I'm a New Mexican. Today, we're going to be going over the APD Backslides in Reforms article in the ABQ Journal by Elise Kaplan. Before we jump into that, make sure you guys hit that like button, subscribe, share it if you like what you see. Agree or disagree, leave a comment. Let me know how you guys are feeling about these videos, those type of things. But anyways, let's go ahead and jump into this. So the report, APD Backslides in Reforms. Albuquerque, New Mexico. The latest report card on the city's efforts to reform the police department is in, and it's not good. It says APD has taken several steps backwards in training officers on court-mandated policies and holding them accountable when they mess up. In fact, in some ways, the department is further from completing the process than it was 2 years ago, according to the report. So we're further back. There's multiple reasons that could be, but let's go ahead and read the article and see what's going on. So why is APD even in this process? Well, back in 2014, after a lengthy investigation spurred by years of controversial police shootings and use of force, the Department of Justice found that APD officers had a pattern of practice of using excessive force and violating citizens' constitutional rights. We'll stop right there for a second. They're going to violate constitutional rights when the laws they're forced to enforce are unconstitutional. It's that simple. I mean, but at the same time, if you're a criminal committing a crime, don't expect to have much rights at that point in time. All right. Let's get back. The city and the DOJ entered into a court-approved settlement agreement, commonly referred to as CASA. I don't understand why they got to use big words that really don't do anything except for confuse the reader. That colloquially just means commonly. So the CASA that lays out 276 requirements for APD to follow. 276 requirements. That's a lot to be adding in. So the requirements range from creating the Mental Health Response Advisory Committee of community partners to advise APD to a wide-ranging revamp of how officers can use force against citizens and how they'll be disciplined if they use it excessively. So a Mental Health Response Advisory Committee of community partners is to tell the police, the APD, how they can use force against citizens. That makes no sense to me. Why are we having people who don't deal with crime telling people how to deal with criminals? But anyways, who tracks whether APD is following the reforms? The city pays an independent monitor, Dr. James Ginger, a former police officer and longtime consultant on similar endeavors, and his team to meet with APD. City officials and stakeholders periodically to assess how the police department is doing. The team puts out 300-plus page reports about twice a year assessing compliance. So we have a independent monitor who is writing reports on APD for the city officials and stakeholders. Okay, another outside source on the APD. Okay, APD is judged on whether it has the necessary policies in place, whether it's training officers and whether officers are being held accountable for not following policies. After years of making progress in each level, APD backslid in the two most recent reports. Report 12 covered February 2020 through July 2020, was released in November. The most recent report 13 covered August 2020 through January 2021, was released on Monday. The DOJ and the federal judge James Browning used those reports to determine what steps need to be taken. For example, after the last scathing report, the DOJ and the city agreed to hire an external investigating team to oversee the work of the Internal Affairs Force Division. All right, so they've already brought up the mental advisory community people, the independent monitor, and now a external investigation team to oversee the internal affairs. So all the way off the bat, we already got three sets of people scrutinizing everything a police officer does from the get-go. Like that for scrutinizing their job and making sure they're following policies and whatnot. Okay, let's continue on real quick. Let's look at this little chart we got going on. How is APD doing on this reform? So the independent monitoring report compliance levels. So you can read the primary is this green or turquoise or teal or whatever you want to call it. Does APD have all the policies it needs in place? Its secondary is APD adequately training officers on all those policies. And then the last one, operational, or APDs officers following those policies and being corrected or disciplined when they do not. So let's see. They have, according to this, all policies are in place. All right. Are they adequately training officers? Well, they're in about the 90 percentile of training their officers. Officers following those policies and being corrected and disciplined, they're about the 60 percentile. So let's break this down a little bit. You can always add policies. Policies can be put in place every day. So adding 276 policies is not the issue. You can add those all days long. Now, training requires time and funding. So how do you expect their training to get better during this whole situation we're in, during the whole defund the police movement? I don't see any way that training can get better while we're yelling defund the police and taking away money and resources from the police. And then last, our officers, following these policies and being disciplined when they're not, they're about 60%. Well, the fact of the matter is, let's look at this from a different standpoint. Let's look at this like you're running a restaurant, all right? You're running a restaurant and you're about 20, you only have like 12 people on your staff, but you need about 24 to run it properly. So one day you get pushed down from a corporate office, 20 new policies you need to enforce. All right. So you're working alongside with your employees and you're trying to, you introduce these policies to all of them and tell them about it. So so you're working constantly because you're understaffed. You're trying to train these policies while you're working, while you're hiring, and while you're doing all these other things that you already had to do. All right. Next, it comes down to your employee. Now, your employee is, may or may not have heard the policy. Depending on who the boss is, may or may not have heard the policy, and they may not follow it right away off the bat, especially when morale is low. I mean, it's hard to train a new policy when morale is low and the policy just seems like it's something that is out of place. And that can be said the same thing with the APD. Right now, APD is 200 officers short. 200 officers short. Not only that, the crime rate is on the rise. Crazy on the rise. It's not going down, it's rising. Not only that, we have a ton of homicides going on. So right now, our officers are working overtime, being stretched thin, and doing the best they can, while at the same time trying to learn 276 new policies. You see how that goes? Let's continue going into this and we'll get further into that. So what did Ginger and his team say in this report? On controlling use of force, over the years, the monitoring team has made hundreds of recommendations designed to assist APD in its efforts to reform its use of force practices, and in truth, APD has implemented numerous reform processes. Despite that, however, we continue to see out-of-policy uses of force at APD. More importantly, it continues to be apparent that APD has not had and currently does not have an appetite for taking serious approach to control excessive or unwarranted use of force during the police operations in the field. Undisciplined, in short, APD is willing to go through almost any machination, any plot or scheme, just so you know, another one of those words that doesn't need to be in there, any plot or scheme to avoid disciplining officers who violate policies or supervisors who fail to note policy violations or fail to act on them in a timely manner. Let's go back to the morale aspect of this. How do you expect people to follow a bunch of policies when their morale is low? Just think about this in any job you're in. When morale is low, people don't want to do their jobs. It's just that simple. And when you're being scrutinized by multiple sources, so right now we've already talked about 3 sources, and we can talk about the defund the police movement and the politicians who support it. Those are other things that are demoralizing. And then you got people like Antifa and BLM screaming all cops are, bad, which I don't believe. Not all cops are bad. There's going to be bad people in every profession. It doesn't matter which profession you're in, but there's going to be bad. So they're trying to say that they are coming up with plots and schemes not to punish these people. And the fact of the matter is, it's not a plot and scheme not to punish someone for doing their job. Over scrutinizing the police for doing their job and supporting criminals is the problem. Y'all need to stop supporting criminals and start supporting the police. I want to see these excessive use of force complaints, because I guarantee you 9 out of 10 of them, they're going to be resisting arrest and people who were committing some type of violent crime or something where, yeah, they had to be forced to comply. What did you want the cops to do? Just wave at them and let them run away? I mean, you guys basically already do that by demoralizing the cops when they arrest somebody, and then you just release them back into the street. Anyways, how does APD Chief Harold Medina respond? I know everyone wants us, the Monitor and the DOJ, they want us to move faster, and there's a frustration. It's just we're a huge aircraft carrier in terms of police departments, and you just don't make a turn with an aircraft carrier and immediately turn. It takes us time to be able to navigate these changes and put all processes in place. Medina took over APD on an interim basis in mid-September, a month into the reporting period, and was confirmed to be chief in March after the period had ended. He's right. Like, yet again, right now we're having an understaffed issue in the police department. It's that simple. APD is understaffed like crazy. And then they're having to deal with tons of homicides and the rise in violent crime. It doesn't help as well that officers are resigning like crazy because of this scrutiny of them doing their job and the fear that they're going to have their life taken away from them because they did their job. Now, it doesn't help that they're being forced to enforce unconstitutional laws in some cases, but at the same time, how do you expect them to do their job with the low morale and the lack of support? And, like it said, you can't just turn the ship around, especially when you're 200 officers short. It's going to take time. And then not only are they 200 short, it's a revolving door. Lots of these people are still just coming out of the academy, which in that case, we need to look at our academy training and make sure that they get their proper training. But when you're stretched thin and you're dealing with a rise in crime, how do you expect to get training and stuff done, especially while people are trying to defund you? It makes no sense to me. All right. And what do the stakeholders say to that? I would buy that argument if you had a staff that was willing and ready and able to turn the aircraft carrier around, said Robbie Heckman of the police advocacy group APD Forward. I get it. It's a big organization, but when you add the culture to it, the culture is just eating the reforms for lunch again. What culture? What culture are you talking about? There's no culture. The only culture that's out there is the defund the police culture. And yeah, if you're going to defund the police culture, it's going to eat these reforms alive. Because yet again, how do you expect any change from a demoralized police force? It's just like any business. How do you expect good work from a demoralized crew? When you got cops who are afraid to go do their job because they're afraid they're going to be put in prison for life for just doing their job, how do you expect them to want to do change? I feel like most of this is to help criminals. Right now, there's 3-4 different groups of people who are constantly reporting and scrutinizing the police for doing their job while they're understaffed and dealing with a rising crime, and criminals are just being let off the hook. We need to do better. As a community, we need to support our police. As citizens, we need to obey constitutional laws, I should say, because and as a police officer, you shouldn't be enforcing unconstitutional laws. And we'll get into that. That's on another thing. But anyways, so where is APD backsliding the most? One of APD's biggest problems over the past year had been training officers on policies related to use of force, crisis intervention, and more. Lack of officers, lack of supplies, lack of funding, you're going to have that issue, of course. In short, APD failed to perform its training responsibilities in any reasonable or meaningful way despite warnings from the monitor. Ginger wrote, "There is no subtle way to express the significance of APD's failure other than to document here that they have again self-inflicted a loss of compliance because of their lack of attention to basic organizational training needs. It's incomprehensible that the leadership of APD would allow such of a lapse of momentum." Do you really think that the leaders in APD are the reason the lapse of momentum? Or do you think it's the politicians and all these activists and rioters who are screaming defund the police and that all cops are bad? I mean, how could you want to help reform a police agency when all you do is get scrutinized and told you're doing your job wrong every day? Think about it this way. We'll go back to the scenario of running a restaurant or being in charge of a restaurant. So you're the general manager of a restaurant and you have a district manager or a regional manager who's never in the store, but they show up every so often. And just like a week ago, you were hit with 20 new policies. They show up and then the first thing they do is start yelling and complaining about certain policies not being followed and berating your employees for not doing it that way and telling them they're doing their job wrong. What do you think happens to that crew, to your employees? They get demoralized, they start hating their job, and then they eventually quit. And that's exactly what's happening in the police force right now, is that, yeah, maybe excessive force was being used in certain cases, but yet again, excessive force cases need to be taken case by case, and the criminal needs to be held accountable for the criminal's actions. If you're going to commit a crime, you need to face your consequences. So if you're going to resist arrest after being caught red-handed and they get a little handsy on you, yeah, you deserved it. Just saying, you deserved it. It's not the cop's fault for your scratched up face when you're sitting there squirming and wrestling with the police officer to try and get out of being handcuffed. Okay? So people who are sitting here like scrutinizing the police, in my opinion, you guys are supporting criminals. You are supporting the criminals and you want them to get away. You basically want the cops to be like, oh, you committed a crime. Come here and put your hands up. Oh no, he's running. Bye, and wave goodbye to them. That's not how it works. How do you ever expect crime to fall if we can't enforce the laws and allow our officers to do the job and to catch these criminals? And it doesn't help when you guys just let the criminals go. And by you guys, I mean the politicians and their stupid policies. All right. How did this happen? APD Chief Medina tells the Journal, many of the trainings were hampered by COVID-19 and the state's public health orders, which is gathering and contact scenarios difficult. Which made gathering and contact scenarios difficult. He said training were initially pushed back a month or so in March 2020, but of course the pandemic stretched on, and just as things started to stabilize over the summer, there was another big spike in virus cases in the fall, shutting down the state again. It's not an excuse, it's a fact that needs to be taken into consideration because there are some things that weren't feasible, he said. It's a good point. How do you expect these police officers to do any training when they're told they can't get with each other and do the training? They're being forced to stay separate. That's just a minor factor because, yet again, we got police officers who are retiring and quitting the force and moving on to different departments. and just being replaced by rookies. We got with COVID and the riots that happen, how do you expect change? Especially when, like I said, the cops are being scrutinized like crazy for doing their job. How many of you are willing to pull someone over and walk up to the side of a car and talk to them about them violating the law? Not many of you. Actually, none of you, unless you're a police officer. Because that's what they do every day. Police officers have to go up to random people every day, not knowing the circumstances and hoping they get to go home to their family at night. Can you say that's how your work is? Just wondering, because if you really want crime to stop in Albuquerque, it's support of the police officers. It's not pushing stupid unconstitutional policies. And quit supporting the criminals. Quit letting them back out on the street. I don't know. It seems simple to me, but yet again, Albuquerque has gone crazy. It's gone crazy. Do you like being one of the top crime-ridden cities in the United States? Because this is the type of stuff that makes us the top crime-ridden city. Is when you're over scrutinizing the police force for doing their job, that they're so afraid to do their job that either they take forever to respond, or they don't respond, or when they do respond, they end up using excessive force because, hey, the criminal's doing something they shouldn't have done. Those are my opinions. So is there anything good in the report? Let's see. APD's Force Review Board, made up of common staff and members of the city's administration, was harshly criticizing Ginger's previous report for signing off on inadequate force investigation. This time he was much more complimentary, saying it was transitioning to a more self-actualizing stance, with some members increasingly willing to question the department's pattern and practice issues. Basically, it was clear most members were doing their homework and thinking about how to make changes in the department. Hasn't the city hired someone else to get the reform efforts back on track? In early March, Mayor Tim Keller appointed a superintendent of police reform to work on bringing APD into compliance. Sylvester Stanley, a four-time police chief in New Mexico, oversees the reform effort, internal affairs, and the academy, therefore freeing Medina to focus on crime fighting and recruiting. Stanley was hired after the reporting period had ended. Medina said he expects by the time the next report is out, they will be both answering questions on him. So you got the Sylvester Stanley, you got the external investigation on the internal affairs, you got the medical advisory or the mental health advisory group, you have the Ginger group, and we have way too many people telling police officers how to do their job. Where are all the people telling criminals to stop committing crimes? I mean, I'm sorry, but it's just ridiculous to me that we would be scrutinizing cops for excessive use of force. What is excessive use of force? Is it somebody getting a scraped knee? Is it somebody getting a broken wrist? Because, I mean, I want to see these reports and not just the opinions on the reports and I don't know what to say here. I really don't, because it's just frustrating to me that we sit here in a city that the crime rate is just on the rise. Murders are out of control. We're understaffed in police. And yet all we're doing is screaming and yelling at the police and nitpicking everything they do to try and protect us. I support police. I really do. And I hope police don't enforce unconstitutional laws. But at the same time, I know that they have to get up out of bed, and if they have a family, they kiss their family goodbye, not knowing if they're going to come home that day. And here in Albuquerque, here in New Mexico, with drug trafficking going crazy and all these non-violent drug dealers being let out of prison, crime is on the rise. And We can't afford right now to be losing police officers and over scrutinizing them for every little thing. But with the way the media treats them, with the way BLM talks about them, with the way Antifa talks about them, with the way our politicians talk about them, how do you expect them to do their job? The fact of the matter is the criminals are winning, and they're supported by the Democrats and their policies, and they're supported by BLM, and they're supported by Antifa, and all these people who are screaming, defund the police. If you're screaming defund the police, you support criminals. It's just that simple. We want reform. We do. We don't want people to use excessive force, but the only way to get this problem solved is to start by staffing. If you want to train new processes and new reform and procedures, you need to have the adequate staff to do so. It's that simple. Because until you are fully staffed, you're going to be so stretched thin that your officers, when they do come to a training course or something, aren't going to be mentally ready for it. They're not going to be mentally prepared, and they're going to come in resistant because they're morally crushed. Their morale is crushed. And how are they supposed to get behind things while their morale is crushed? We need to be supporting our police officers, lifting their spirits, showing that we don't want criminals in the city, showing them that we care about them and their lives as a human being, and help raise the morale in our police department. That's the only way we're going to be able to solve these issues. Until we bring morale up in the police officers, until we bring morale up among police officers and get adequate staffing in the police force, you really can't expect much change. It's just that simple. That's really all I have to say about this matter today. I mean, agree or disagree, leave a comment, let me know what you think. I truly believe the only solution to this is staffing and raising the morale, so that way they can get their training and they can be on board with this. Anyways, I'm Nick Driver, I'm a New Mexican, and I care about you.